I think the abuse that I was already experiencing at home put me in a position where, when I was ritually abused at the camp, I'd already been conditioned to accept that type of abuse, to believe that that was what men did to young boys, to believe that there was nothing I could do about it because it was the way the world was. Because I knew in my family home that I couldn't speak out about what my father and my mother were doing, it made me aware that there was really no one that I could turn to for support. I think it was obvious to me even as a child that if I told my parents about what had happened at the camp, it would have raised too many questions about what was happening at home. I already knew the rules of the society in which I lived were adults abuse children, adults sexually abuse children, and the children must keep quiet. So when I was then taken to a camp where I was sexually abused, it seemed to just be a much more violent extension of what I had already been exposed to. I'd already been primed, in a sense, to accept that type of abuse, to accept it as normal. So the context in which I was sent to the camp was one in which I'd already been abandoned as a kid. I had no emotional connection to those around me. I was incredibly vulnerable to any display of affection or kindness from an adult, which would often turn into sexual abuse. I was abused in a social context in which it was normal to abuse children.
You were taken to a location in the north of England. What happened there?
I was taken to a camp run by an organisation called Outward Bound, and it was extremely isolated by a lake. The two most abusive teachers in that group that I remember, the history teacher, he was called Mr. Newman, an English teacher, he was called Mr. Sewell, and they both worked at King's House School in Richmond in London, where I was sexually abused many times by many different teachers. We were driven to the camp in 2 different minibuses. I remember when I arrived there feeling very isolated. On the way to the camp, we'd stopped at Alton Towers, which is a theme park. I remember the English teacher who had previously sexually abused me at the school. I think I had this growing awareness that those who were taking us to the camp seemed to be grooming different children in the group. So I think I already had this sense as we were travelling there that there was a lot of fear in me. There was a lot of fear in me that I disguised. So many activities that I was taken on by abusers, there was this presentation of it being an adventure, of it being something fun. So whilst I wanted to go to the theme park and I liked the idea of going on an adventure holiday because I'd seen the brochures that they handed out at school, I think I was hoping, despite all the odds, despite the fact this seemed to permeate every aspect of society, I think I was hoping that perhaps this was an adventure holiday, perhaps this was something enjoyable that I could participate in with adults, perhaps it was an experience that I could be involved in without being abused. When we got to the camp, I remember it being very isolated. There was a lake and a boathouse. There was a small recreation room with a video game inside. It was one of the old video games that was kind of under a glass sheet. I remember it took 20 pence pieces. And I remember that between being abused, a lot of us would hang out in that recreation room and put 20 pence pieces into the Space Invaders machine. So it felt like a way of distracting ourselves from what was happening. I remember being very worried, as I think the other kids were, that we would run out of 20 pence pieces. It felt like this video game machine was the way in which we escaped from the camp. It was the only space in the camp where I felt like I wasn't in the camp. For a few minutes we could sit in front of this video game machine, this Space Invaders machine, and not be there. Yeah, I guess I never really acknowledged how much that game helped. I'm very glad that someone made that game and put it there. And later on I went to design video games, so I feel like maybe some other kid played one of the games that we made and was able not to be where he was or she was too. Yeah. Then at night men would visit the camp. Cars would pull up in the driveway and men would come out of them. They'd take us into different rooms and they would abuse us. I could hear kids being abused in other rooms. I have my own experiences of being abused there. It seemed to typically happen quite early in the morning, around 2 or 3 in the morning. Dreading that moment in the night when I'd be woken up and taken out of my bed. I remember being burned by them after being abused, often with cigarettes. I remember the violence of the rapes that I was subjected to. I remember they were dressed in different costumes. Some of them were dressed as police officers. Some of them wore masks. It was filmed. I feel very, very angry at those men. I feel very angry at the school. I feel very sad at what happened to me. And I feel very strong. I feel like they relied on me never being this strong. They relied on the children they abused never being strong enough to speak out. And they did that through a series of practices which are well defined as ritual abuse techniques. One of these techniques was to tie a child's leg to the ceiling and to spin the child from the ceiling until the child was so disorientated that they would submit to anything, that they would split themselves, that they would do anything to avoid remembering or feeling the pain of what that experience was like. After I was spun, I was also taken to the lake where the men would nearly drown me. They would push me under the water until I was nearly drowned, and then they would drag me up from the water, and they'd keep doing it, and they'd keep doing it, and they'd keep doing it. And they seemed to know when it was that they'd conditioned us deeply enough that we would never speak out, because then we would start wetting the bed. As soon as you've traumatized a child enough that you can regress them to an earlier stage of development, then you know that you've done significant damage to their nervous system, and you know that it's very unlikely that they will ever speak out about what you've done to them because you've stored it in a pre-verbal form. It's very, very hard for them to ever speak out about what they did. And those men used that, the fact that we started wetting the beds, as an indication that they'd damaged us enough that they knew that it was safe to let us go. And they kept other children at the camp, and there was a girl called Claire, and we became friends. I now know that they were doing this in order to create a bond between me and Claire, which they would later abuse. One of the evenings I was taken into a shed on the grounds of the camp, and Claire was there, and she was tied in a chair. One of the men who was stood around her had a fork in his hand. He told me to stab Claire with the fork, and I refused, and I started shouting, and then he grabbed my hand with the fork in it, and he pushed it into Claire's face, and he did that again and again. After that, the men stood around me, and they shouted at me, "Look at what you've done, look at what you've done, look at what you've done." And they kept shouting it until I believed that I had done that, but I had not done that, they had done that. And I don't know how many children they had done that to, but they did that to me. I don't want them to do it to any more children.
If you feel comfortable with this, maybe you could talk about the rituals that you remember being forced to participate in.
What was done to me and to other children is that we were taken out into a space outside the camp. There were graves dug in the ground. We were put into the graves, and then the graves were sealed, and then I was left there overnight. So I was essentially buried alive overnight. I feel this is like a big basis for my fear of death. I see no reason to fear death. It would just be transition to another space. I think what I had always feared was being put back in those pits by those men. I think as a kid I thought this is death, being stuck in a pit. Time seemed to stop. I wasn't aware of how long I'd been left there. I didn't know if I would be taken out of the pit. I'm also aware again that listeners are probably thinking this sounds wild and implausible. If you feel that, then it worked. Then it worked. Then exactly what those men wanted you to believe, which is that this didn't happen to me, that they couldn't do this to children. It worked. Just like they wanted to hide the Holocaust, but didn't manage it. It seems like they have almost managed to hide this. So there's a few voices like my voice and your voice who speak out, and other voices who are joining us around the world. It's a very strange life to live, carrying this, but I'm glad that I'm speaking out. I'm just thinking about Claire more, and I really struggle with this, regardless of what anyone listening thinks about, maybe dubious of what I'm telling them or disbelieving. I think you have to consider this, and that is that several months ago I reported the murder of a small girl called Claire to the British police, and they've asked me nothing more about her. Is that normal? Is it normal to report a murder to the British police force and for them to not ask anything about it? And I have emails from the police acknowledging the receipt of my statements, and what I have from them mostly is silence. It's 2018. I reported the murder of a girl called Claire to the British police force. And for months, there has just been silence. Who are these people?
Did you try to tell anyone about what happened to you at the time?
It became quite clear to me at the time there was no one to tell. People at the camp who abused me appeared to be police officers. I was taken there by school teachers. My parents were sexually abusing me. It wasn't apparent to me who I could tell. Didn't seem to be an individual in that society in any position to listen or to help. Almost all of them seemed to participate, either through abusing children, through denying that abuse was happening, or ignoring it. When I came back from the camp, I, like many of the other children who were abused there, became very ill, and we were off school. I was off school for a very long time. I have school reports that reference the time I was away. The story that the school told was that we had got ill on account of algae in the lake when we'd gone canoeing. But the truth was that I, like many of those children, was very ill because we'd been raped by men who came to that camp who prostituted us. But that wasn't the school's story. The school's story is silence. Complete silence. I went to the school's Wikipedia page and I added information about a teacher who had been convicted of paedophilia in the school. Someone at the school removed that from the Wikipedia page. And the comment that they left on Wikipedia after it had been removed was something like, "This isn't relevant to the school. This isn't relevant to the school." The fact that there was a paedophile definitively operating at the school. I mean, in my experience, there are many paedophiles there, but there was one individual who had been convicted. This wasn't relevant to the school. Other information on the page included the facilities at the sports ground, that there was a hockey pitch. That there was a hockey pitch at the sports ground was more relevant to the school than the fact that paedophiles operated in the school. I think I want to say at this point that imagine 10 years ago someone had said to you, Bill Cosby is raping women, he's drugging and raping women. I think most people's reaction would be, no, he's so lovely on television. Okay. 10 years ago, if you'd said to someone, Jimmy Savile, he's raped over 1,000 children on BBC property, people would say, oh no, he's lovely, he's on television. I'm telling you now, there are deep connections between an elite British school, the monarchy, and a camp run by Outward Bound. And I'm sure many people out there are thinking, oh no, they're so lovely, they're on television. I invite everyone listening, and I invite them in love, to seriously hear what I'm saying, to seriously take account of this testimony, and to seriously investigate what it is that I went through.
So my last question is, how common do you feel this type of abuse is?
It's hard for me to say how common it is. My experiences, as anyone's individual experiences of anything, would give the impression that it's the typical experience. I was born into a certain time and place. I only have my own experience. I saw it happening to children around me in their family homes. A very close friend of mine killed himself on account of what was done to him by that school. I can see reverberations of what was done to me in society. Others who were sent to that school are now in politics or entertainment. In essence, many of the children at those elite schools, mine in particular, are now managing the country. I think that's terrifying. It's terrifying to consider how many children were conditioned in this way and are now running things. As for how generally widespread the practice is, I can only reiterate what I said earlier, and that is that now that I've reported this crime in extensive detail to the British police, they've asked almost nothing about it. To me, that suggests substantial institutional problem. In the same way that for years and years, those who worked at the BBC walked around, doing their jobs, eating in the canteen, speaking to colleagues, writing scripts, whilst they knew that a man called Jimmy Savile was raping children in the building, whilst they knew that, they just carried on. I can imagine in the police station that's dealing with my case, with my report of the ritual abuse I experienced and the murder of Claire, I can imagine many of those policemen filling in paperwork, chatting with colleagues, doing nothing. Doing nothing. Silence. Just silence.
And this relates quite a lot to the last question, but why don't we hear more about this in the news?
I mean, this is a great question. I think the problem, I already anticipate the problem here, and that is that a lot of listeners will not want to hear the answer to that question. But I think maybe the answer to the question is probably obvious at this point. And that is, who owns the newspapers? Where does the money come from? In what ways are these people connected to those with money and power? In which ways, for example, was the BBC connected to money and power? In which ways have the BBC hidden and concealed the abuse of children in the past? Have they done that on a tiny scale? Have they just hidden 1 or 2 rapes here and there? No. They've consistently hidden over 1,000 incidents of sexual abuse on BBC property. Never mind what happened outside BBC property. And there's been no real reflection on what was done. There's been no real investigation into how that happened. Mark Thompson, who was working at the BBC during the time at which it was revealed that Savile had been raping all these children, he now works at the New York Times. The man who oversaw the BBC as they were reflecting and attempting to understand what happened with Savile, he now works at the New York Times. Now, I think there's a problem here because I think a lot of people might think, oh man, this is some sort of weird anti-media rant. I'm not anti-media. What I'm against is those who have demonstrated themselves to be untrustworthy, those who have demonstrated themselves to participate in various ways in the abuse of children, should not hold positions in newspapers, no matter the name of those newspapers or political leanings. I have no objection to whatever a particular newspaper believes collectively. I have no objection to any particular title. I have a big problem when those who control the media, those who define the parameters in which news is spoken, those who define the topics of the day, those who edit, in essence, the stories that we receive, have a big problem when those people have demonstrated themselves to actively have participated in the abuse of children through negligence or through cover-ups. I think the tricky thing is that they've militarized us against awareness. They even invented this name, conspiracy theory. So anytime you say anything that questions the official narrative defined by these individuals in the media, you're a conspiracy theorist. I mean, what does that actually mean? It just means that you considered information other than that was presented to you. Imagine 10 years ago, oh, I've got this feeling, that Jimmy Savile's raping loads of kids in the BBC. Oh, that's your conspiracy theorist, you mad conspiracy theorist. I've got this feeling, Rolf Harris, he seems a bit weird. Do you think I think I saw him raping a child. No, you're just a conspiracy theorist. Bill Cosby, my friend said that he's been raping women. He's been drugging them and raping them. Oh, you're a mad conspiracy theorist. I've got this feeling the BBC might be institutionally covering up the abuse of children by different presenters. No, that's a conspiracy. What does that mean? It just means you looked at the information available and reached a different conclusion from that which you were presented to by the powerful, rich organisations who dictated it to you. It's not wild, it's not mad, it's very, very sensible, it's very awake. It's very awake to question these things. It's very awake to say, no, I'm not just going to accept what you told me. I do feel like power and authority can't just say, you believe what I tell you or I'll hurt you. They don't do that anymore. They say, you're a conspiracy theorist. What shocks me is that the idea that an individual or a group of individuals would consider for themselves the facts and reach their own conclusion has become unacceptable. It's become unacceptable to reach your own conclusion based on the facts. When I think about what they did to Claire, and I think about how many years I felt terrified and ashamed of what they made me do, I think what she would have wanted me to do and what I'm doing is telling everyone I can about what they did to her and likely to many other children like her. And so, although there's a lot of anger in me about what happened, there's a lot of love, because I know the way out of this isn't to attack those who abused us, but to expose what they did. I have no interest in attacking the school who sent me to the camp. I just want them to stop.